You cannot work a muscle group and directly burn the body fat around it. I wish that was the case, but it's not.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. Speaking of transformation, today we are going to talk about transforming specific body parts. How does that sound, Paris?
Sounds pretty good. I love talking about muscles and I love talking about transformation. So combining those.
Awesome. So I think a lot of people have an idea of, specific muscle groups, specific body parts, specific areas that they want to improve. So today we're going to dive into how you can do that. We're going to get practical. But before we do that, we're going to myth bust a lot. We're going to do a lot of myth busting in this episode around what it really takes to be able to improve specific body parts. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, both objective and subjective opinions and perspectives on improvements. And then from there, we'll go into some very practical, real step-by-steps around how you can target specific muscle groups with training. How does that sound? Anything else you want to talk about today on that note?
Sounds great. I'm excited for the myth busting because I'm sure it's it's just something we hear so often. A lot of things we're going to touch on today. So I'm excited for the audience to hear it.
Me too. Audience, get ready. We're about to drop some truth on these myths. Okay, so before we talk about anything else, we need to bust the myth that you can reduce fat in specific body parts, that you can target fat loss to specific muscles or areas of the body. Let's leave that for a minute. Hang in there, everybody.
Yeah. I'm going to say it one more time. Just in case people missed it. You cannot choose where you're going to lose body fat. This we really need to say. So when you see something like, fat burning ab circuit or something like that, or like, one exercise to burn fat around your shoulders, like it does not work like that. You cannot work a muscle group and directly burn the body fat around it. I wish that was the case, but it's not.
It's crazy because I think so many of us across generations have grown up seeing headlines that say exactly that. The examples you just provided, whether they're magazines, whether it's clickbait articles online, whether it's social media hooks, right? It's all over the place. All of the how to get a flat belly by specific exercises, all of that stuff. It preys upon, I think, our sensitivities. Because a lot of us are very sensitive about specific body parts. Many people, specifically their core area. So, of course, it's natural that if we see those headlines, we're going to go, I want to try that. And I think it's important whenever we see that to take a step back and remember, we cannot target fat loss to specific body parts. If somebody is, though, saying, okay, I do want to, let's say, lose a little bit of body fat around my waistline or my underarms, what is your recommendation for them then? What is the reality? If you can't actually target that, should they just be I guess it's never going to happen for me? Or what can they do?
Yeah. So although we can't choose, we just need to keep losing body fat and keep getting leaner. And eventually those, we'll say, quote unquote, problem areas or more areas that we tend to hold more body fat will eventually decrease. So for example, Courtney and I have talked about this before, but our midsection is the last thing to get lean, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. So it's not like if we do more abs or more rope crunches or something like that, or leg lifts, that we're going to get our abs to show. It's more, we just need to keep getting leaner until that body fat there ends up going away. So a lot of times people just need to keep reducing overall body fat, and everybody's fat distribution patterns are different. So where you hold and lose and gain body fat first or last is going to be different from the next person. We have other clients who their legs store most of their body fat and their midsection is lean when they're, at 18% body fat for men, or, well into, higher body fats for women. And that's just, the game isn't fair for everybody, and it's not better or worse. It just is. But it's good to know where you store your body fat and where it tends to come off first and come back on first or last.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about that in last week's episode where we talked about the role of genetics. And that's exactly what you're referring to here, right? Just that the genetic component will affect your body fat distribution. If you haven't listened to that episode, we'll put in the links below. Go check it out. But I think being self-aware in that sense is critical. And that's where things like taking your progress pics can be super, super helpful along your journey too, because you can actually see, okay, where are those changes happening first? Because we all have that area where it's that body area or body part shapes up really quickly, right? So as you talked about, for us, it's not the midsection. We both share that. But we both keep our limbs, like our legs and arms, stay pretty lean, even when we get into relatively higher body fat percentages. So I think you need to build that awareness of yourself, of like where your body does store body fat. And then you know where you can monitor, right? You can say, okay, I know I'm going to lose here first. Cool. Let's look at that area as an indicator of progress as we make changes. And I say it a lot. I'm going to say it one more time. The scale doesn't reflect those changes. The scale is never going to tell you where your body fat is coming off from, right? So you do need to be cognizant of having those multiple measures of progress for yourself to build that awareness.
Definitely. And also not just looking at one area of progress. It's like if you're judging like how lean you are by only looking, if the fat on your underarm went away, it's like, well, you're missing a big picture, because if that's the last place to go, you're not going to feel like you're making any fat loss progress for a long time. Even though maybe your back all of a sudden got leaner and your hamstrings got super lean, and then you just still have, the underarm fat, but you're only focused on that. So you need to look at things from your whole entire body perspective. And just learn again your distribution patterns over time.
I just have to say it. We're never going to be super objective about ourselves as well, right? That's why it can be really important to have somebody on your side to give you that objective lens, share your progress pictures with, someone, AKA a coach, to be able to help you see those changes and be like, oh, you know what? I wasn't even looking there. And yeah, you're right. That is changing. So using those visual markers of progress, yes, and building your own self-awareness of them, but recognizing that other people can help provide that objective eye for you too. Do you think we busted that myth? Would we consider it busted?
I think so.
Anything else you want to add to further bust it?
The spot reduction, I don't think so. But what I will say, and maybe this might feed into the next point, is that if you have a very developed muscle group, it will look leaner at any given body fat percentage. And maybe we'll throw that in right now. It's probably a good segue, because like, let's say for some reason my quads are like super, super jacked. Even if I have the same body fat on them compared to somebody else, they will look significantly leaner just because of the development. So the easiest way to look lean at any given body fat percentage is just have more muscle mass.
That's a good point. Like, this is a very basic kind of analogy, but I'm thinking of like, let's say you have a plastic bag, right? And that plastic bag looks a little, for lack of a better word, mushy, I guess, because it's just loose. The second you start putting stuff in that bag, it looks tighter and it looks more full, right? It's kind of the same idea here with what you're referring to. Because you fill out that underneath portion with muscle, then it will look more developed. It will look tighter. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, we can use that to simplify.
Super simple. I'm just thinking
yeah.
about it, right? It's kind of logic.
Yeah, no, it's true. So I think like a lot of times, and this is what I see with people that have a lot of muscle mass like on their body, people will assume that they are way leaner than they actually are. Like they could be even actually carrying more body fat than you, but you would perceive them to be leaner just because of the development. So that's another motivation of like, put on some muscle.
If somebody's trying to decide where to put on muscle, how can they start to evaluate that? Evaluate their own physique, evaluate which specific body parts might they want to improve. Now, as we go through this discussion, we do want to keep in mind there are both subjective and objective ways of doing that. We all start with the subjective. Oh, I have this perception of myself. I have a perception of my own body. Most of us say, oh, my core, like, I just want to work on that area, right? But let's start with saying, like, how do you start to evaluate? You can touch on the subjective first, then dive into the objective from there. How do we evaluate where we want to see those improvements?
Yeah, I mean, first off is kind of, where do you feel like you want to make the most progress? And if it comes down to things like core, it's going to be a matter of you just need to get leaner for sure. But if there's specific muscle groups that you really want to bring up or you love, like for example, like a year and a half ago, I was like, I want some shoulders. And because shoulders, in my opinion, completely change your physique and in a fantastic way. I was like, let's prioritize some shoulders. So that was like me subjectively feeling like this is what I want. And it was a preference. Not to say my shoulders were like 100% lacking compared to everything else, but I wanted them to become a strong point based on how I felt.
I share a similar experience, I think, and it's cool that my perspective on this has changed over time. When I was in high school, I always thought, oh, it's great, I have skinny legs, Right. That was the high school
Interesting.
perception that I had. I was like, oh, I didn't enjoy a lot of things about my body back in the day. I had a lot of self-consciousness around it, but I had a lot of pride in my quote unquote skinny legs.
Hmm.
Now, I'm like, how can I build my quads? So it's an interesting shift, right? It's that perception. And I think part of that comes with, me maturing and
Maturing.
growing up, and also then learning more about physique sport and development, and also being confident with putting on muscle and strength. And so it's a shift that I've gone through personally. And now I'm like, quads, quads, quads. And I'm working with my coach to consistently target
Mhm.
the quads. And it is really cool. And, there's no objective reason I need to do that, but it helps me feel really good to be like, you know what? I now also have a way to evaluate my progress in my physique, because if I'm
Mhm.
going in with a specific intention saying, I want to do this for me, now when I look at my progress photos, that's what I'm looking for. It gives me a little bit of direction, which I think is
Mhm.
really, really overlooked too, is like having direction with your journey and with your progress that you're evaluating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you are developing your physique, you are essentially sculpting. And this is what we're kind of doing. So it's like you got to look at yourself as like that piece of clay, and you're adding to it, and you're trying to choose the ratios that you like. If a competition stuff aside, like the ratios that you like and the proportions that you like and the development that you like in terms of aesthetics, it's up to you. You get to choose that. Again, competition aside, you get to choose how you want to look and what you want to develop. And that's powerful. Like you get to look at yourself and say, this is me. And here's what I personally value as this muscle group I want to bring up. That's
Right.
kind of cool.
It puts you back in the driver's seat of your own journey. That's what it comes down to. And I think we both see fitness as an expression of self-efficacy. And that's just another dimension in which you get to live and breathe that sense of control, and the control that it gives you over your own journey, your own outcomes. And to make that decision for yourself and be like, this is the thing I'm going to do. All right. You'll probably do it if you are deciding it for yourself, which is
Yeah.
pretty cool. So you did say a couple times there, competition aside, right? So it kind of makes me think there are situations, and now it's not the majority of us. The majority of us are going to be on that subjective side of things, just doing what makes us feel great. But there are cases where people are being evaluated for specific development or specific areas of their body. Can we talk about that for a second too, just to provide some perspective? And I do want to also recognize that it's very different between men and women. So we'll go into each
Yes.
one. But let's start with the competition prep setting and what a man or a male would do to try to develop specific body parts based on the evaluation criteria that might be.
Yeah, so I think we can go a little bit more general just because there are a lot of different divisions, and different divisions, their optimal physique, quote
Quote
unquote,
unquote.
is going to look different depending on the division. Like, for example, if I were to compare men competing in men's physique compared to bodybuilding, they're not looking for the same ratios and same development. So I think you need to know what is the type of physique that your division has. And this is an extreme sport, and what you care doesn't really matter. I'm sorry. If you like, oh man, I don't want to work any of my legs, and I want to have tiny calves, but I just want to do only upper body. But I also want to be first place in a bodybuilding show. I'm sorry. If even if you like that as your best physique, the judges don't care what you like. If this is a cutthroat sport, and it's very much either they like you more than the other person or they don't. And that it's tough to say, but that's the way it is. So in a competition prep setting, you need to know your division first, know what kind of physique they're going for, and then you need to try to match that. No matter what you personally feel is the best physique, you need to match the division for a competition prep.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it is cutthroat. And when you do sign up for that, you are signing up to have your body objectively evaluated, which is a really, really, really hard thing emotionally,
It
mentally,
is.
which is a completely different topic. But I think having objective criteria at least can help give you, again, a sense of direction, and also recognizing that yes, they are going to be critiquing your body, but there are criteria involved. It's not just saying like, oh yeah, I like this person. You can at least start to understand why, or what your strengths are or your relative areas of opportunity are. And I think that that's true for both men and women, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Same thing. Just, yeah, obviously, like what the criteria they want is different than men and women, but same system of like how to optimize your physique for
Mhm.
competition. Yeah.
There might be people listening to this who also find themselves kind of in the middle ground. They're like, okay, I've worked on my subjective things that I want to work on. I'm not going to be a competitor or go into competition prep, but I do want to develop, quote unquote, an objectively aesthetic physique.
Complete physique. Yeah.
Right. So if somebody came to you as a coach and said, hey, where do you think I should be prioritizing in my next steps? And they wanted your objective opinion, but they're not saying I want to compete, but they're happy with where they are with their own development. What kind of guidance might you give them? And let's, again, break that down, male and female, just based on what tends to make people feel good about their physiques from your experience as a coach, and also a little bit of that eye of, oh, that wow factor when you see somebody's body.
Yeah. So I think, well, it's funny because I asked, so whenever I'm like thinking physique stuff for my own progress, I'll ask my coach, and I'll also ask like either friends or people I know in the industry that I trust, like their eye, because it's very hard to look at yourself objectively. But I think for women, definitely like the muscle groups that stand out are like glutes, delts, and lats, right? Because that's what it's going to give you that nice hourglass shape. If you have nice shoulders that sweep into nice lats that come out into nice glutes, like, you're objectively usually going to have a pretty good physique. For men, delts, lats are also extremely important. I would say just for V taper, delts and lats are a big one. And then we could also maybe put arms in there because it looks weird if you have big delts and tiny arms. I would say this might be an unpopular opinion, but chest from a silhouette perspective would maybe be fourth. Like it doesn't actually objectively change your silhouette that much when you have a big chest. And again, if you have a big chest and small shoulders, it just does not look complete. So I would say shoulders, lats, then arms in terms of that like aesthetic small waist, broad shoulders type look for men specifically.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what you said about women too, and like that kind of establishing that hourglass physique. I think as a woman, one thing I hear from other women and from my own inner thoughts once in a while is this idea of women chasing like a smaller waistline, right? And that's your bone structure. So let's just again, I'm going to bust another myth. You cannot change the size of your waistline because those are
The
bones.
hips,
Or your
yeah,
hips, yeah, true.
yeah,
Okay, so your hips, waist area, but like if you think about that bone structure, like I have wide hips, that's not going to change. But one of the things you can do is develop, to your point, you talked about the shoulders and the lats, right? If you develop that visually, the perspective and the perception of your waist does change because your ratios change. So I just want to put that out there because I think there might have been women who have heard, oh yeah, developing a smaller waistline but if your hip bone structure is the way it is, that's it. But you can still
yeah.
do something. It's not to say that like you can't do anything and you can't work on it. So when you talked about that hourglass establishment, like that's what came to mind for me.
Yeah, because well, if again, you can't shave down your hip bones to shrink them, but you can get leaner. You can build your glutes, you can build your delts and your lats, and guess what that does? Makes your waist look much tinier. This game is all based on illusions, and really, if you want to build a good physique, it really starts with thinking of a silhouette of a person and like what muscle groups really kind of stand out to create that silhouette, and those are usually the muscle groups that, when prioritized, make the biggest emphasis in terms of changing your physique.
I love that. The silhouette. That feels really tangible. That feels
Mm-hmm.
like a really tangible way to start to envision potentially what your body could look like. Okay, so let's get practical. We talked about myth busting. Spot reduction is not a thing. We've talked about subjective and objective ways that you can start to evaluate, where you might want to change your body. Let's dive into some of the practical considerations. When it comes to actually making those changes, safe to say, most of it is going to come from training, right? From your actual training development. Can we talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can prioritize for lack of a better word, lagging body part or a body part that you're actively trying to improve through your
Yes.
training?
Yeah. Great point. Tons of nuances, but we're going to drop some serious value here. Prioritizing some muscle groups. The first thing I want to say before even getting into practical strategies, or this might actually fall under that umbrella, is technique is such a big one because some people will say, "Oh, I can never get my delts to grow," for example, but their lateral raises look like a bird trying to fly away. right? Or they're like, oh, I can never grow my chest, but their chest flies look like their shoulders are rounded forward and they're using all front delt. Or they say, I can't grow my quads, but then their hack squats look like, they're going a quarter of the way down. And, it's just like, fix the technique first. Every exercise that you're trying to hit a muscle, you should be thinking, how can I maximally stimulate this muscle group in this exercise? And what am I trying to target here when I do this? So that's actually number one, is just cleaning up your technique without even talking about volume or progression or anything like that. Just cleaning up your technique. How do you feel about that?
Oh, important. Because I think so many people are so worried about, what's the perfect exercise for my chest? And we'll talk about that in a second and why that's a problematic thought. But it doesn't matter if you're doing the quote unquote ideal exercise if you're not doing it properly or not doing it in a way that's actually stimulating that muscle group. That's what your muscles are going to respond to. They're responding to tension. They're responding to the stimulus that you give them. So if you're not actively stimulating it, I don't want to say it's wasted effort because that sounds kind of harsh, but it kind of is. Like you go into
it's inefficient effort.
Inefficient effort. Yeah. That's it. That's a nicer way of putting it. So number one, technique. The number one thing you can do then is fix your technique or evaluate your technique. Make sure you're actively stimulating the muscle you intend to be.
That's first things first before you touch any other variable. That's the first variable we want to talk about. The second variable I would say is, I have three more variables, so we'll touch on each of them because they're all important, is prioritization in terms of priority first principle of the muscle groups I want to emphasize. I'm sliding them up further, closer to the beginning of my session. So for example, if I'm trying to bring up my quads, for example, I'm not going to save that as my last and final movement because by the time, there's a diminishing returns, over the course of your session and how much bang for your buck, because fatigue, you get tired. Okay. Basically you get tired. So the sets when you're fresh at the beginning of your session are going to have much greater impact, and bang for your buck compared to later when you're more tired. So if you're trying to prioritize a specific muscle group, you want to put that volume closer to the beginning of your session.
Right. Yeah, I think we've all been there where you get to that last exercise in your workout and you're like, oh my God, I'm dragging through this one because you've done so much already, so much output. So making sure you have the most amount of energy and potential to give to the exercises that are training that muscle, that's your priority. And that's a great way to start building a program.
Absolutely. And personally, this is funny. My calves are still small objectively, but they have actually grown. Okay. This is funny. They've actually made some good progress. And one of the reasons why is because I no longer save them as an afterthought. The technique has improved and we did some more lengthened work and pauses and stuff like that in the stretch. But also, they're no longer an afterthought. Like for a lot of times on my leg days, they were the second exercise, for example. Right. So just think of it. Don't save those muscle groups. They're weak maybe because you just hitting them as an afterthought when you're already super tired. So, yeah.
That's a really interesting way of exemplifying the concept in practice. A lot of people think that the smaller muscle groups, I think, need to be trained last. It's like, it's an isolation movement. I'll just put that at the end because my compounds are more tiring. But your isolation movements can be a really great way of actually targeting a specific muscle, especially if you're trying to prioritize a small muscle group, right? Like if you are somebody who's trying to prioritize your side delts, maybe you actually need to put lateral raises before your bench press. So thinking about prioritization of muscle groups and not just dividing it between compound and isolations.
100%. Generally speaking, yes, compounds logically should be split up. But as Courtney said, especially for people that are past that entry beginner stage, for sure, a lot of times I will program, for example, lateral raises before a major pressing movement, as an example.
Yeah, and we are talking here about physique development and training for physique development. So just reiterating for people that obviously if you're training for different purposes, this may or may not apply, but we are talking today about training structure for physique development.
Yes, love it.
You said you had 4 points, right?
Yeah.
What's number 3?
So the third one is going to be volume. So what do you think would grow my biceps more if I did 1 set a week of biceps or 6 sets a week of biceps? So we'll talk about volume and frequency. Okay. So I'm sorry, there's so many variables here, but we'll group volume and frequency. So volume we'll just quantify as the number of working sets per week that you hit for a specific muscle group. Okay. And it does correlate most of the time to a certain extent, we're generalizing, with more growth. more hypertrophy. So if I want to bring up a specific muscle group, I should logically be putting more volume towards that muscle group over the course of my week. Now the problem that people run in is like, oh, okay, I'm going to go 5 more sets in my arm day of biceps, but again, diminishing returns over the course of the session. It would be much better if you took those 5 sets, put them on a different day, so you have 2 or 3 times per week frequency, which is another great way to bring up a muscle group, is increase the frequency. And usually when you do, you're also increasing the volume. That's why we're talking about them together. And so playing with that as the next variable after your technique is good. And what was the second one we said?
Prioritizing your exercise.
Prioritizing in the session.
Order.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to play devil's advocate or to prompt some deeper thought on this, let's say.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I'm trying to hammer my quads. I'm going to do 25 sets a week because volume is key, right? And I'm going to spread those sessions out. I might do like 5 times a week, 5 sets each. Is that too much? Is there a point of diminishing returns, or like what would be your guidance on that? And how do people actually apply volume in a way that's productive?
Yeah. So we could do a whole podcast on volume, but it's a great question. And what you need to do is don't start with a super high volume. And also, this is muscle group dependent. Like for hamstrings, you cannot do 20 sets per week of hamstrings. However, for your delts, you can probably do that effectively and still recover. So
because of recovery, right? I just want to hammer that home.
Yeah.
Recovery kind of becomes your limiting variable there.
The time course of recovery, depending on the muscle group, it varies greatly. And then secondly, you also got to, as Courtney was saying, like you got to know where your volume sits. Like maybe she can recover from that volume, but I can't. So you need to, I would say, start with lower volume and then work your way up, and you'll end up kind of figuring it out. And then also when you're prioritizing one muscle group, you have to think about sometimes you deduct volume from stronger muscle groups or muscle groups that are not on the back burner, but you're not focusing on as much, to give more resources and more time and energy to drive progress in the other muscle groups that you're working on.
Right. So ultimately, the takeaway for people when it comes to planning volume to prioritize a specific muscle group, tell me if I get this right, would be you look at your total work that you're doing over the course of a week. So how many sessions you're doing, how you've split those sessions across different muscle groups. And then within that, you start to assign, okay, how many sets am I doing across each of those sessions, and how am I dividing them over the course of the week to prioritize this specific muscle group? Is that fair evaluation?
Yeah, I like it.
Cool. Awesome. I think we're rounding home base here with your point number 4 on how we can target specific muscle groups with our training. What would that be?
Yeah. So as you guys can see, there's a lot of gray areas and nuance with training, and this is why individualization is needed. Exercise selection. Now, if you're first getting started, most people, you don't need to even really think about this yet. Just choose an exercise that hits a muscle group and train hard and progress over time. But if you're consistent and you're trying to maximize your progress and you're already well into your training career, I do think we do need to talk about exercise selection. And there are exercises that are theoretically better and subjectively better based on how you feel the stimulus is compared to other exercises. So first things first is theoretically better. It's like, okay, does this, hit the target muscle group I'm trying to hit in a great way and allow me to put tons of tension? Setup is good stability. I'm having a lot of tension in length of position, for example, like those kind of variables. And then subjectively would be like, do I actually feel a great stimulus pump? Do I get DOMs there, like delayed onset muscle soreness? Am I feeling like that muscle is actually getting fatigued? And that's
got to be working.
Individualized. Yeah, it's got to actually be working. So those two things.
And that kind of almost like brings us back to the technique place that we started. You said the first variable to consider is your training technique, right? And there are going to be some cases in which technique will fix that subjective feeling of how an exercise feels. And you can get more from a specific exercise by adjusting your technique. Absolutely. But there are going to be cases where your technique can be okay or fine or even great, and you're not necessarily still feeling that. And that just relates to how we are as individual people, that subjective perception, your own, way that your body's structured. So I think being aware of that too, and again, it's something that you develop, I think, as you become a more advanced lifter, how you start to actually feel with that exercise. So that, again, could be a whole podcast topic on itself, because like you said, there's a lot of nuance and gray area to each of these. But I think if you are sitting there going, I don't necessarily feel this exercise subjectively, first go back to step 1, technique. How's your technique looking? And then if you continue to try and you finesse your technique, and that might just not be the right exercise for you, and that's okay. There's a variety of exercises out there that you can choose from to target any given muscle group.
For physique development, there's no have to exercises.
Yeah, that's a really important part too. Awesome. So I think today we're making great progress on this conversation. I think we're ready to wrap things up. But before we start to do so, are there any final thoughts on if somebody's sitting there now going, okay, I feel like the myth is busted. That's great. I feel like I can make maybe a subjective decision around areas I want to prioritize. Maybe I'll look for an objective perspective too. And I now feel equipped to walk into the gym and start to assess how my training can support the development of specific areas. Is there anything else people can do, or did we capture all of it? I mean, I don't think we'll ever capture all of it, but the main things.
But I think we did a pretty comprehensive job today. And again, from the genetics standpoint of like, you have like which muscle groups are more dominant or fat distribution patterns, watch that episode that we did, I think, last week, right? So like that will kind of fill in the gaps of a lot of this discussion, I think. But yeah, I'm pretty happy how we communicate today.
Me too. It is a tricky subject, so I'll give us some credit. It's a tricky one because we said it so many times, there is a lot of nuance. But because I'm always thinking about food, I do want to leave with this question, because this is a very training heavy episode.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to sound like a silly question, but bear with me because I want to make sure if somebody's wondering it, we've covered it. Is there anything you can do food-wise to change specific body parts? Can you eat certain foods? Can you adjust your nutrition? Is there anything on that side of things that will play a role here?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I figured that's what you're going to ask. Sugar does not make you store more body fat than anything else. And there's no foods that make you burn belly fat or make you put on belly fat. It's all about eating too much that makes you put on body fat. There we go.
All right, we had to say it. We had to go there. No specific foods or no specific diet in terms of like this thing will shed body fat in this area or this area. Just not a thing. Wow. If you are considering, we talked about developing specific body parts through training, and a lot of that is muscle growth. And Paris explained earlier why muscle growth can also change the aesthetics, of course. But if you're somebody who's focused on fat loss, right, putting on muscle in certain areas will aesthetically make that area look more toned, quote unquote toned, right? But if on the nutrition front, because nutrition still does matter, the only thing you can really do is adjust your calorie intake to suit your goal of either fat loss or muscle gain, right? And that's really what it comes down to. And I think if you are looking for fat loss in specific areas, just keep going with an appropriately structured and intentional calorie deficit, and it'll come in different areas, but it will happen.
Yeah. And I think something else that we can end off is sometimes you don't even know what muscle groups are dominant or not until you take the body fat off. And when I was younger, I thought I had so much more muscle than I actually did. I was like, man, my arms are huge. My chest is full. And then you got lean. You're like, I do not have nearly as much muscle as I thought I did. And the muscle groups I thought were dominant weren't dominant. I was just holding more body fat there. So I think it's humbling, but it's also makes you transparently be able to assess your physique. Because I think unless you're actually relatively lean, you won't know what groups are more dominant than others typically.
That's true. And then it gives you a really fresh canvas to say what's next.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I feel like I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. I love the continuous nature of improving your physique. There is no end game here, right? So I think this idea of like, when you do get leaner, it's just a great opportunity to say, hey, how do I think I look? How do I feel about this look for me? What does this canvas look like for me to start painting on top of it? So I think that's a really powerful, empowering sentiment to think about. Going back to 100%. Control. You get control back over your own body and your journey, which is pretty cool.
And again, when you have an objective view, they'll tell you, like I straight up asked my coach when I was like super shredded before my show, I was like, hey, what muscle groups do we need to bring up? He's like, upper back, would love to see some more of that. A little bit more chest popping in there. And I was like, done, let's hit it. You know what I mean? So like stuff like that. But anyways, it's nice because sometimes you'll skip those things. It's good to have an objective eye, but yeah.
For sure. Thank you to everyone for tuning in again this week to our episode of Truth Talks, covering off how we can improve specific body parts or specific muscle groups. We really appreciated it. If you have questions, drop them in the comments and we'll be sure to answer them, or reach out to one of us or Truth Body Systems as a whole. You know where to find us. If you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe. Or if there is a specific element of this podcast episode that we talked about that you want more depth on, because as we said, each of these is a very nuanced topic, let us know and potentially we'll do a future episode on that too. All right. Bye for now,
Awesome.
everyone.
Bye.